The debt ceiling crisis. What will happen if the U.S. defaults on their debt with a deadline coming up October 18th, and how will it impact you and your financial future? I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's really start by understanding the problem the government and the Treasury currently has. It starts off with Janet Yellen herself. Oh, I forgot to write Janet right there. What have I done? Well, at least we've got Yellen pointing to this stick figure that is obviously Janet Yellen. Should not have to say that. But she came out yesterday, the day prior on CNBC, and says, listen, if the U.S. defaults on their debt, if we can't pay our bills, if we miss that deadline, October 18th, this will not only force the U.S. into a recession, if not a depression, it would be catastrophic. Those are her words, not mine. So why would this happen? Well, it's pretty basic. You guys understand this. If you're watching my videos, you've seen it on CNBC, Bloomberg. If the U.S. doesn't pay their debt, that makes them a bigger credit risk. We saw this back in 2011 when the same thing happened. Standard & Poor's downgraded their credit, which usually makes interest rates go up. Now, ironically, since then, interest rates have gone down. But theoretically, interest rates should go up. If this happens in the real economy, the whole house of cards comes crashing down. Auto loans go up, mortgages go up, credit card payments go up. This crushes the U.S. economy. Also, wealth funds like these giant hedge funds and pension funds, they rely on the price or the yield for these treasuries being stable. If we saw interest rates on the 10-year treasury spike from 1.5% to 3%, 4%, or 5% in a very short period of time, this would collapse a lot of those funds and take down a large portion of consumer spending with it. Because so many Americans' future spending relies on large pools of money, such as pension funds. Well, let's not forget about the stock market and the housing market. Interest rates go up, most likely stocks come crashing down, and nominal prices of houses could go down as well. You can imagine what would happen if mortgage rates went from 3-4% up to 8 or 9%. That reduces the purchasing power of a lot of buyers, which means a lot less demand. That most likely means prices going down. But again, you guys can hear all of that on CNBC or Bloomberg. You don't need to tune in to the George Gammon channel and watch a whiteboard to figure that out. So let's dive into the details. This is the stuff you're not going to hear on the mainstream financial media. Let's start by going over a chart of the TGA, the Treasury General Account. This is basically Janet Yellen's bank account, and it is a liability of the Federal Reserve. So the dollars that are in the TGA, again, are not a liability of the commercial banking system. They're a liability of the Fed. More on that in a moment. So the chart starts at 2006, goes all the way to 2021. On the left, we go from $0 up to 1.8 trillion. What's staggering is that going back to even the GFC, the TGA rarely had above 40 or 50 billion. And you can see what happened when Trump got in office. Then it started to go up to 200 billion, 400 billion. And then when we had the cerveza sickness, it spikes all the way up to $1.8 trillion in the TGA, a staggering amount. And you may scratch your head and say, well, why on earth did that happen? Well, this is what you have to do when you have $5 trillion spending packages, or $3.5 trillion, or whatever the CARES Act was, whatever these stimulus packages have been. When you spend trillions and trillions of dollars month after month, you have to have a lot more money in your bank account to begin with. So what this means for the government is usually issue more bonds at auction, which have gone onto the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. But right now, the TGA sits at about 190 billion. And this seems like a large number, but it's really not when you think about all the expenses Janet Yellen has to pay over the next few weeks because of your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam deficit spending like a drunken sailor. So what Janet Yellen is saying is that if the government doesn't increase the debt ceiling and allow her to borrow more money, taking the United States and the taxpayers further into debt, mortgaging the future of our kids and our grandkids, then she's not going to be able to pay all the bills that are coming due. So that may be interesting, but I don't think that's really the important part of the story. And to understand what's really important and what will most likely affect your financial future, we have to look at the balance sheets of the entities involved when Janet Yellen is paying expenses or sending checks into the real economy, or when the government is taking dollars out of the private sector through taxation or borrowing. So let's think this through. We've got the Fed on the left, assets, on the right, liabilities. The government and the banking system, the commercial banks. We've got a balance sheet for the banks here, assets on the left, liabilities on the right, and then we've got the balance sheet of the private sector. So let's start with the Fed's balance sheet. Liabilities are reserve accounts for the commercial banks, for a lot of them, and like I said earlier, the TGA. So this bank starts with assets that are the bank reserves. Those assets are dollar-denominated liabilities of the Fed, but they are assets of the commercial bank. Now, their liabilities are the deposits, just like your checking account with Wells Fargo or Bank of America. Those dollars that the bank says you have in your account, you really don't have any dollars in there. It's just them saying they owe you that many dollars. So that's a liability of the commercial bank. And then, of course, that's an asset on your balance sheet. So when the government taxes individuals, as an example, the way most people look at this is the dollars leave the balance sheet of the average Joe when he's paying taxes, let's assume. Goes to the government gives it to the Fed, and then the Fed deposits it in their account. But in reality, it's different. Here's what I mean. Let's go back to the balance sheet of the bank and the Federal Reserve. So the average Joe, these dollars, like we said earlier, are deposits in a bank, but they're a liability for the bank, asset for average Joe. So if he tells the bank to wire your drunk insolvent Uncle Sam $100, let's say, to pay taxes, and let's just say he has $100 in his account, well, then the deposit disappears. It's no longer there. So the bank has fewer liabilities. But they also had those assets, those bank reserves, to match up with the $100 in liabilities. So let's say $100 in bank deposits, $100 in bank reserves to back up those liabilities. So what actually happens is when Joe tells Wells Fargo to pay the government, they delete the deposits and then they transfer the bank reserves from their reserve account at the Fed down into the TGA, the Treasury General Account. So the dollars don't really go from Joe's bank account to the government, and then the government sends it to the Fed, and the Fed puts it into the TGA. We kind of think of it as though it were just paper money or gold coins, something like that. In reality, what happens is the deposits are deleted, the liabilities of the bank takes the corresponding assets, the bank reserves, and has the Fed transfer them from their account down into the TGA. But the main takeaway from this entire visual is to realize that when we think of all this money circulating in the real economy, going from the private sector to the government to the Fed, in reality, what's happening is it's just a transaction on the Fed's balance sheet where bank reserves just go from one account to the other. The only other thing that's happening are liabilities of the commercial banking system are being added or subtracted. So you have an addition or a subtraction of a liability in the commercial banking system, and then you just have a movement of bank reserves from one account to the other on the Fed's balance sheet. That's the only thing that happens when money circulates in the economy. So the next step is try to figure out, okay, George, the government understands they're in this position. If they default, how is it going to play out, and what is going to be their most likely solution. Step number 2, the MMT solution. Let's remember that Janet Yellen, if she is close to defaulting on payments because they missed this deadline, October 18th, is going to have people like Mosler and especially Stephanie Kelton whispering in her ear or maybe shouting out at her through emails saying, Janet, MMT will save you. And Mosler's saying, Janet, remember, MMT is good. It's not bad. And all the MMTers will be sending her DMs on Twitter saying, Janet, you've got to understand, the government is the currency issuer. It's not the currency user. Therefore, it can't go bankrupt. You can issue as much currency as you want. There are no constraints on government spending. Therefore, this debt ceiling doesn't matter. Even if you can't borrow the money, even if you can't get the taxes to get the funds into the TGA, the bank reserves we talked about in step number 1, just send out the checks. Just send out the checks to whomever needs to be paid, and they'll just take those checks, deposit it in the bank, and nobody will know the difference. For more insights on how this would work, editor, let's cut right to the internet.
So the fourth point is, there is no solvency risk for a government that issues its own currency. There is no possibility of bankruptcy. When President Obama tells us that the US government has run out of currency, he is misinformed. Can't happen. The US government can always issue more. It's not possible to run out. There's no chance that running budget deficits, spending more than tax revenue, is going to bankrupt the United States government. Can't happen, because we can always issue more. We can always make all payments as they come due.
So let's think about this. If there's absolutely no constraint on government spending whatsoever, the debt ceiling goes bye-bye. It is no mas. Why does the debt ceiling not matter anymore? Because the government doesn't have to tax. The government doesn't have to collect revenue in order to spend dollars. And this next part is absolutely key. This is crucial. This would mean there is no limit, no constraint on the politicians spending money to buy your vote. Whether it was with the Green New Deal, universal basic income, universal health care. So all the politicians would go from being Keynesians, which was the first school of economic thought that allowed them to spend money like a drunken sailor, and they would all now and in the future be Keltians, Keynesians, Keltians, there you go, Keltians, I guess, that makes sense, which would rip off any shackles that may have remained that would prevent them from spending trillions and trillions and trillions more than they otherwise would have. You see, with Keynesian economics, at least there's a constraint on government spending. With MMT, there is no constraint whatsoever. The amount of money or dollars the politicians can spend buying your vote is limitless. So just to give you a visual, your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam right here holding a sign that says, I love MMT, spends all of these dollars into the real economy. They go onto the balance sheet of the average Joe and the businesses, the non-bank entities in the real economy. But now Kelton and Mosler and maybe Yellen will say, hey, we don't need to collect taxes. We don't need to issue any more debt. That's old school thinking. And therefore, we have solved the problem of the debt ceiling in the first place, because the government no longer has to take on or issue any debt to spend dollars into the real economy. But as you would imagine, there is a problem. And we're going to get into that in step number 3. But before we do, I want to make it very clear that if the US defaults, if we miss that deadline on October 18th, I think it will push us closer and closer to MMT. Step number 3, moving from MMT to FedCoin, or a central bank digital currency. We go back to step number 2, and I said that there was a problem with the MMT philosophy when you look at it through the lens of the way the system is set up today. And when you see the way the system is set up with the Federal Reserve and the Treasury and the government and the commercial banking system, you see that MMT in its current form is a hashtag fail.
Oh! You're all failing right now.
Meaning that it won't work. Like the gentleman said in the video in step number 2, it is true that the government is a currency issuer. There's nothing to constrain them, technically, from printing as much currency or dollars as they want. But what this gentleman didn't think through is that there is no constraint on the government. There is a constraint on the commercial banking system if the system stays the way it is today. Again, with the Treasury, the Fed, the government or the Treasury, and the commercial banking system. So let me go ahead and explain. Let's go back to step number 1 and think about one of the main keys from the visual is that the commercial banks need assets to match up with their liabilities. And their liabilities are those deposits from the businesses and the average Joe and Jane, the non-bank entities in the real economy. So let's think this through. The MMTers like Mosler and Kelton come in and say, Yellen, you need to start doing MMT. And she says, okay, no problem. The government is a currency issuer, not a currency user. So regardless how much money we have or don't have in the TGA, I'll just go ahead and send out the checks. Okay, so all those checks go out from the government. The businesses, the average Joe, the non-bank entities in the real economy get those checks. And what do they do with them? Well, they go ahead and deposit them with their local bank. So let's say that you get one of those checks, the average Joe watching this video right now, and let's just say it's a check for $1,000. And let's say that you bank with Wells Fargo. So you go down, you deposit the check at Wells Fargo. Well, what does that do? That gives Wells Fargo an additional liability for $1,000. You say, okay, George, I get it. But let's take it to an extreme. Let's say the government gives you a check for $10 trillion. You go down to Wells Fargo, you deposit that check. Now what you've done is given Wells Fargo an additional liability for $10 trillion. What does that do to Wells Fargo? They go tits up. They're bankrupt immediately, insolvent, negative equity. So like I said, there may not be a constraint on the government, but there is definitely a constraint on the commercial banking system. And if the commercial banking system is relevant to the real economy, then effectively there's going to be a constraint on the government. Now, the MMTers will most likely push back and say, yeah, George, but with MMT, we're combining the Fed and the Treasury, so this really wouldn't be applicable. And the Fed can always just issue notes. They can issue $100 bills instead of those checks. But I would point out that, number one, we haven't moved into that system. And what's the probability of us moving into that system prior to trying MMT in the first place? And even if the Fed did print up $1 trillion worth of bills and send them off, there's still a liability of the Fed. So yeah, you wouldn't be tanking the commercial banking system. They wouldn't be insolvent, but the Fed sure would be. So I'm not saying the Fed can't have negative equity. What I'm saying is that gets very, very complex. And the bottom line is, if the system stays the way it is, if it's not dramatically changed, then MMT won't work without collapsing the commercial banking system. So I think the central planners will realize this quickly and come up with another solution. Well, if the government can't send out those checks, let's just have the Fed send out those checks. So how is this different? Let me explain. In our first example, the government sent out the dollars or checks that were denominated in dollars. Let's go back to the example where they sent out $10 trillion check to the average Joe that he tried to deposit with Wells Fargo. Well, the reason MMT is great on paper is because this wouldn't increase any of the liabilities of the government. They wouldn't be issuing treasuries. They wouldn't be issuing debt or bonds. Therefore, they don't have to worry about a debt ceiling because they're not taking on any additional debt. But see, the issue is that the TGA, the Treasury General Account, or the bank reserves denominated in dollars in the TGA is zero, goose egg, nada. There's nothing in there, right? That's why when the government sends out that $10 trillion check, that there aren't assets to back up the check. You see, if there was $10 trillion in the TGA, then that $10 trillion worth of bank reserves denominated in dollars is a better way of saying it. They would be transferred to the reserve account of Wells Fargo. Then you would have an asset to match up with the liability. But if there's no dollars, there's no bank reserves in the TGA, there is no asset. That was the first example. But if the Fed were to send a check to the average Joe, then the Fed can go ahead and print the bank reserves, the funny money, the fugazis.
It's a wazzy, it's a woozy, it's a fairy dust. It doesn't exist. It's never landed. It is no matter. It's not on the elemental chart.
Out of thin air, and they're really not printing them. All they're doing is going to the reserve account of Wells Fargo and adding $10 trillion to their balance. This becomes an offsetting asset for that $10 trillion liability. So we usually talk about a central bank digital currency being relevant because all the non-bank entities in the real economy would have an account with the Fed. Their dollars would be a liability of a central bank, not the commercial banks. But what we forget often is that these commercial banks, most of them already have an account with the Fed. So the Fed has basically been using Fed coin for decades and decades and decades. It's just we don't call it Fed coin, we call it bank reserves. But I think they will change the Federal Reserve Act or ignore it altogether so the Fed can use Fed coin not only with the commercial banking system, but with all the non-bank entities in the real economy, the businesses and average Joe and Jane. So the bottom line is if the government misses the deadline, October 18th, if they default, if Janet Yellen can't pay the bills, if they can't raise the debt ceiling, I think the probability increases significantly that they try MMT. And if they do this, I think the probability increases significantly that we move into a central bank digital currency. I think we're moving in that direction regardless, but I think this will speed up the process tremendously. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.